An average of 4 people are killed every year by sharks, and those attacks are not usually unprovoked. The truth is that sharks are actually far less deadly statistically than crocodiles, hippos, snakes, spiders, or even mosquitoes. And yet, they feature more than any other animal in horror films. In fact, it's probably likely that sharks are some of the most ubiquitous monsters in all of horror. Ever since Jaws, audiences have been fascinated and terrified by the idea of sharks lurking under the water, waiting to attack us. And filmmakers have constantly tried to tap into that fear. In 2010, Australian film director Andrew Traucki made The Reef, a truly terrifying movie based on a true story about a great white shark hunting the crew of a capsized sailboat in the Great Barrier Reef. In 2017, Johannes Roberts made a similar film, a survival thriller about 2 women trapped underwater 47 meters below sea level and hunted by deadly sharks. Both films achieved huge financial success, proving that sharks continue to be some of the most bankable monsters in horror. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of nature in horror, and we discuss 2 tense shark films from the 2010s, The Reef and 47 Meters Down. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Muncer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 10th season, exploring the evolution of nature biting back in horror, and this is part 30. Oh, we are getting there. We're on the home stretch now because we have reached the 2010s in our series. This week, as that intro suggested, we're going to be discussing 2 terrifying shark movies, The Reef from 2010 and 47 Meters Down from 2017. Both of these discussions will be spoilerific. Give them both a watch. Just prepare yourself before you listen to our discussion. So, joining me to discuss this week's movies, I've got a brand new guest. She's an artist, a creative, a lecturer, an academic. She does so many things. She's a very good friend of mine. I've been wanting to get her on the podcast for a very long time. A big welcome to Juliet Sugg. Hello, Juliet.
Oh, hi, Mike.
Hello. It's so lovely to have you here, Juliet. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Good timing.
Juliet, it's your first time on the podcast, so tell people, just for people who don't know, tell us a little bit about kind of who you are and what you do.
Sure. So I'm a bit of a mixed bag. I am an artist and a lecturer, and I specialise in the monstrous feminine, which is where my kind of crossovers with horror start to sit. And I'm also the co-founder of the Deviant Collective, which is a new thing alongside the writer and poet Tracy Heather Johnson, where we look at kind of interdisciplinary and collaborative expressions in art and literature around the monstrous feminine and all things naughty and abject.
I love it. And me and Becky Dart came to one of your exhibitions and we did like a talk together, didn't we? The 4 of us in London. It was so much fun. But I feel like you and Tracy kind of like kindred spirits when you found each other and your interest in that kind of monstrous feminine and that whole area, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's always lovely, isn't it, when you are a horror fan, because I think you quite often feel like you're a bit of a weirdo. So when somebody comes up and goes, yeah, I'm really into that shit too, it's a really nice feeling, isn't it?
I love it. Yeah. And what's next for you guys in terms of Deviant? Like, what have you got coming up?
So there's a couple of things. One is the journal. So we want to kind of collaborate with 3 journals every year that's different kind of writers, artists, performers, filmmakers, anything really that's creative that looks at similar kind of themes. And then we are touring the exhibition. So the brilliant and very, very kind exhibition that you and Becky hosted for us in London. We're looking at going to Glasgow and then possibly kind of into Europe if we can make finances work. So, yeah.
That's so cool. That's so cool. And just like to tell people a little bit more about it, like what can they expect from it? So it's essentially kind of like the exhibition, it tends to be kind of the art by you, right? Paired with kind of poetry and writing by Tracy?
Yeah, it's a genuine collaboration because I think people quite often assume that I've illustrated her poems or that she's kind of created work from my paintings, but it's much more a case of almost that childhood game where you would pass over one thing and ask the other person to react to it. So we're just, we're looking at, in the first exhibition in particular, the idea of kind of female sexuality and monstrosity, and those of us that maybe kind of fit outside the boundaries of what we expect proper women to do and be.
I love that. That's so interesting. How do you find, because I've talked about this subject a lot on the podcast over the last few years, the kind of the slight erasure of sex, and particularly kind of female sexuality, I think, over the last sort of 10 years or so, particularly in more mainstream cinema, right? It does sort of start to feel like, this year with movies like The Substance and other things, it feels like it's starting to sort of creep back in, right? But what are your thoughts on that? Like, it did seem to sort of disappear for a while, didn't it, I think?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that was a big reason for us doing the project and talking to you guys in particular, because I think that it's kind of coming from a good place, this idea of wanting to be really respectful around sex, particularly around female sex. And as we know, as horror fans, there are definitely lots of kind of problematic examples. But I don't believe in erasure. I think that the fact that they are there is interesting. They become a kind of archive for change, for evolution of how we handle any kind of gender on screen, particularly sex.
Yeah.
And I think, like you, I'm really relieved, actually, to see that, for me anyway, there's a bit of a sea change. So actually now we're starting to allow sex back in. And I think horror is such a good kind of genre to work within things like this, because it doesn't have a strict moral compass. So it does kind of move around and allow difficult questions and, difficult examples. So hence our kind of starting with horror, really.
I love that. And I think it's a really interesting kind of nuanced area, because sometimes I feel like, am I being contradictory? Because I will, for example, last week, me and my guest talked about, we talked about the ruins and Frozen and that kind of era of 2000s, slightly kind of bro-y horror. And there is, and we were kind of slightly complaining about a sort of, I don't know, a kind of leeriness about a lot of movies made at that time in particular. Almost felt like it had regressed even from the 90s, I think. But there is a difference, isn't there? I think, between I guess sex and exploring sex, and then also just having that kind of, I don't know, that kind of lad culture 2000s era movie. Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. And I think particularly I'm a little bit older than you, but I think we're coming from a similar place in terms of our contemporaries in horror were those films that were coming out in the 2000s.
Yeah.
And I think it's not until you look back on them that you realise, Jesus, actually, they were really dodgy.
Yeah.
And that we weren't as progressive as we thought we were. I think there were more interesting things happening in the 90s. And then it became, as you say, all about this kind of bro college American boys. It's kind of sad in a way, I think, when you look back and you realise, oh shit, I was kind of part of that generation. So that's probably affected the way I've, moved within it.
Definitely. And then I think that the reaction to that decade paired with kind of Me Too and stuff, right, around 2014, I think that is the reason. I think, like you said, there's good intentions there that I would say from around 2013, 2014 onwards, everyone was trying to be super careful in how you portray women and how you portray sexuality and sex and all of that kind of thing. But I think then the pendulum swung too far the other way, didn't it? That's the problem. It's like a really tricky ground. Yeah.
Well, that's it. Then you get into the water, which is sort of a good thing to think about with this particular episode.
Yes. Yeah.
You get into this murky water of then just denying sexuality, which I think is equally as dangerous, and particularly for women, to kind of say, you can't be portrayed as being sexual or enjoying sex in any way. Yeah. So we're in a really interesting time, I think, to look at this stuff.
We are. Really interesting. So there you go. So that is all kind of all the really interesting stuff that you and Tracy kind of deal with anyway in your art, right? So it's really, really fascinating stuff. So yeah, I mean, for people listening, get yourself along to these exhibitions, because there's some amazing stuff to look at and hear as well, in those exhibitions. I absolutely loved it.
Thanks, Mike.
So tell me a little bit about your kind of horror origin story, Juliet. How far back does your love for horror go? Do you remember your first kind of horror experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think for those that know me now, I am obsessed with horror and I kind of wear it on my sleeve. So it's always a bit of a surprise when I tell people that at the beginning I was absolutely terrified of them. I really was a scaredy cat as a child. I hated the dark. I hated anything that was kind of bodily. I had a real kind of fear around the idea of finding a dead body or coming across it. And at some point, I think I would have been fairly young, probably about sort of 9 or 10, maybe even slightly younger. I just remember, and somebody might have said something to me, but I remember thinking, okay, the way to deal with this is to really confront it, is to really look at it. And I remember coming on late at night. Do you remember there was that really cool time, probably again, like late 80s, early 90s, when Channel 4 used to put these old films on?
Oh,
so
yeah.
Good.
So good.
Oh, it was like my little, proper baptism.
Yes, yes.
And it was Night of the Living Dead. That's what had come on. And I was absolutely transfixed. And I think the fact that it was black and white and old made me feel a bit safer before quickly realising, no, this is some really dark shit, but absolutely loving it. And then the pendulum did swing, where all of a sudden I couldn't get enough and just started to eat it, wherever I could.
That's so interesting, isn't it? How so many of us have that kind of story where it's like almost too scary to want to even face it. And then at some point you go do a complete 180, right? And go the other way. I wonder why that is. Like we reach a certain age or certain point in our life, then suddenly like that's all we want is that kind of content,
It's a thirst almost, yeah.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. What's your kind of go-to these days in terms of your horror taste? Do you have a particular kind of subgenre or type of horror movie that you tend to gravitate towards more?
I think that I've really, by nature of the thing about horror, I think particularly in contemporary horror, is it's difficult to surprise us and it's difficult to generate something new. And so I've actually become quite broad in terms of where I'll kind of go and what I'll look to. But I think at the heart of it, I still love a folk horror and I really love a good ghost story. And I think it's really hard to do. I can't name you many great contemporary ghost films, but that probably is my favourite.
Yeah, I would completely agree with you about those two as well. Like, whenever a new one will come out, be it folk horror or ghost story, I will always get excited, I think. Particularly a ghost story. You're right. Like, did you watch Oddity from last year? Did you watch that? Because that I thought was a really fun, creepy, enjoyable ghost story. But you're right. We don't get like a lot of good ones these days. Yeah.
Oddity is a really good example, isn't it? I loved that. And it's my jam when it's a little bit weird and British and strange. Yeah. So, yeah. It's hard. It's hard to do and to make us believe it now, I think.
I agree. Well, let me ask you, Juliet, what are your thoughts on like animal attack movies, nature horror movies, eco horror movies? We've been talking now for months and months and months about all these types of films, whether it's kind of Jaws, The Birds, animal attack films, natural disaster films, all of these kind of things. What are your thoughts generally on that kind of subgenre?
What I love about this subgenre and what I think is really clever about your decision to cover it is that compared to other kind of subgenres of horror, I don't think it's ever going to go away.
No.
I think we're always going to be afraid of of nature, right? Of things that we can't control. And what I really like about it at the moment is I think because of what we're going through in terms of kind of ecology, in terms of sustainability and in terms of guilt, that it's opened this space to really make us able to use it in a fairly kind of organic way. Yeah. So it's funny, I wouldn't say I would reach to look for a nature bites back, but I think I would always be interested, and I'm definitely kind of into it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's one of the things I've learned from doing this and watching so many of them is that it's so ubiquitous. Like there are so many of them that get churned out every year. I think it must be one of the most kind of enduringly popular sort of subgenres as well. It's like every year, even last year alone, if you think about all the new kind of spider movies and shark movies and everything else that we get now on streaming and that kind of thing. Why do you think that is? What is our fascination with these types of movies, do you think?
I think ultimately it's the what if. We all want to know, if I was in this situation, what would happen? What would I do? And more importantly, who would I become?
Yeah.
Would I do the right thing? Would I be an absolute coward and die a hideously kind of cowardly death? Would I be the hero? I think that's a huge part of it. And I also think that it's to do with our innate understanding that essentially we're animal, that all of these luxuries and technologies and structures we've built around us, they're not actually able to take us to the end of the world. And I think that there's always a curiosity about what would I do without them.
Yeah.
Plus COVID, I think, has made us sort of even more aware that perhaps we're not so much in control as we think we are.
Totally. And I think that is a really interesting element too to this subgenre, because obviously I've gone quite broad with it. And I think there's something very fun and frothy and popcorn movie about a kind of shark attack film or whatever. But then you can go the other way too. Like next week, we're going to be looking at Melancholia and Take Shelter. And, you dip into like pandemic movies and virus movies. And suddenly it becomes a lot more uncomfortable for people, right? And I think there is that very real threat that, nature, this planet could like fuck us up at any given moment, right? And we've kind of all learned that over the last few years since 2020 too, right?
Exactly. I mean, even a power cut and we lose the internet for 20 minutes, we're all distraught.
Yeah, exactly. Are you like much of a kind of outdoorsy, at one with nature person, Juliet? Like, are you good at kind of being out there with the elements?
I'm a funny mix. So I live in the city. I've lived in London for about 19 years now. But I grew up, so my first kind of chunk of life was in Papua New Guinea. And then my family moved
That's
to...
so cool.
Did I never tell you that?
No.
Weird fun fact. So yeah, I had this very kind of very much slightly different lifestyle, living in the wild to some extent, and then living in Suffolk and Devon when we came back to the UK. So I had this weird kind of, I always have to get out of the city. So I will always kind of be somewhere fairly rural. And I absolutely love walking. I'm ridiculously kind of, reliant on being able to kind of just get away and be on my own and trample about. But I'm also the kind of person who will fall over really easily, who will forget her phone, who will, take the wrong direction and end up in the wrong place. So I have this kind of strange respect that I have limits, that I know I'm never going to be a mountaineerer. A long 2-hour walk in the woods is it for me.
You got any phobias? How are you with things like spiders, creepy crawlies, that kind of thing?
This
or
really annoys me because I think of myself as somebody that is quite hard to rattle, but I'm fucking terrified of spiders. I'm absolutely terrified of them. And I become inconsolable when there's one around.
Oh my God, I love that. That's amazing. Yeah, I think I am such a wuss about so many things, but thankfully I'm okay with spiders, at least in this country. But if I was like Australia, I think I'd have a meltdown every time I saw any spider, just in case it could kill me, right?
Exactly.
What about sharks, Juliet? I mean, I feel like it's for whatever reason, and I don't think this is a rational thing, but I feel like it's the animal that human beings fear the most, right? It's so strange. What is it about sharks that terrify us so much?
Well, when you asked me to do sharks, it was really fascinating to me because I'd not really given it any thought. And yet, when I watch shark films, I am fucking terrified. Like, I'm definitely, as you say, as most people are probably, but there's something inbuilt in me to think that this could be one of the worst possible deaths I could imagine. And, again, I don't think, in fact, I was having this conversation with a friend this morning who said he was thinking about going into a shark cage. I don't think I could do it. I don't think I could do it.
No.
I'm too aware that my body is not meant to be stronger than these things.
There's something about them, isn't there? Like, I would say that probably more than any other movie monster in this subgenre, shark is the one, right? There are so many, we could all name tens and tens and if not hundreds of shark movies at this point. Ever since Jaws, they've always been so popular and they've always managed to scare us. Again, like, it's really interesting. There must be something psychological or instinctual or evolutionary in us, right, that knows to fear these creatures.
I think it's something to do with, if you see a lion or a tiger or even a bear, there's something kind of recognizable in them, particularly big cats, right? Even if we are aware that they could kill us, we still kind of think, I can see my cat or I can see a dog within that. With a shark, I think they are totally alien creatures to us. They are essentially big fish with really big mouths that could do serious damage. And I think there's part of their kind of alien, but also it's that simple thing of them being below the water and we cannot see them. We cannot predict them. There's almost a bit of a kind of existential fear for me around, being in the sea, there's no mountain, there's no tree, there's nothing I can do.
Yeah.
Right? I'm at their mercy. I think that's a big part of it.
I completely agree. It's so true, actually. In some ways, it makes such a brilliant movie, Muncer, because it looks like a monster. Like, it has teeth like a monster. It moves really fast. It comes out of nowhere. It can chomp you in half. Like, it looks like something that could have been created in a horror movie, right? And then also, like you say, it's got that added layer of it hides because it's under the cover of the ocean. So, and it's interesting, the two films we're talking about, one of them is kind of set on the surface and the other one is set right at the bottom of the ocean, right? And either way, there is scope there for like some proper, almost like haunted house style scares, I suppose, in nature. Yeah.
That's so interesting, actually. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. The fact that it is sort of above and below. You're totally right. You're totally right. And yet I find the above scenario more scary, I think, not seeing what's down there.
Even we've got this fascination as human beings, even like on YouTube, right? Like, people are obsessed with watching like shark attack videos on YouTube and stuff. Again, there is this, we all have this like weird, morbid fascination with it for some reason.
I think, well, you asked me earlier, I think, this idea of, you know, why do we watch them on YouTube? And you're right. I mean, I think there's probably more shark attacks on YouTube than there is, say, a big cat attack or insects attack, right?
Yeah.
It's a definite kind of trend. And I wonder, again, if it's to do with the fact that physically you can get away with showing a shark attack easier because some of it is concealed by the water. So it has that kind of old-fashioned thing that we often talk about, that what is most scary is that which we can't see. So there's something about being able to really see somebody either dying or having serious injury, but yet we can still kind of see it on YouTube, and that makes it more frightening, I think.
Yeah, exactly. It's that funny, and I guess this goes for horror generally, that we watch horror in a way as a catharsis, right? As a way to kind of live out these real life, dangerous, threatening, horrific, terrifying situations. And there's something kind of weirdly kind of therapeutic about it, about like sitting in a safe environment and kind of experiencing that. And you know, whether that's like a ghost movie or a serial killer movie. But I guess, again, with nature movies, that is in some ways the most kind of like the closest to something that could really happen to us. So I guess that's why these types of movies, and then shark movies of all of them, are the most successful, because, again, we all kind of want to know, oh, could we survive that? Have these people survived it? And how did they manage it? Or what did kill them? And that kind of thing, you know, there's like, yeah, again, it's kind of, I certainly do this when I watch these sorts of animal attack movies, is that I constantly go, what would I do in this situation?
Exactly.
You know, probably die, Juliet, to be honest, probably die.
Well, that's totally it, isn't it? It's the kind of, is there any hope within this? Is there anything that I could do in order to survive? Right. And it's even things like, you know, when you see interviews around real shark attacks, what would I do if I didn't have an arm, if I didn't have a leg? You know, you're kind of really being forced to question truly kind of terrifying parts of our understanding of our bodies, I think.
Yeah, God, and the experience of watching these two movies, I actually found quite stressful. And I've talked about this a lot throughout this season, that after last year I did home invasion movies, and you know, for so many people that was the most triggering kind of awful subgenre. So many of my guests are like, I don't watch home invasion, it's the one area I can't do. And I totally get it. For me personally, I actually find these movies more scary and frightening than home invasion films, because I feel like, I don't know, for whatever reason, I think that I could probably reason with a human being or figure out a way. But when you're out there in the elements, I would not have a hope. So I find them very stressful. And there's a particular kind of subgenre of this area that a lot of people call kind of survival horror movies, right? Which is like, there were a lot of them around this time for whatever reason in the 2000s, films like Open Water and Frozen, which we did last week, and The Ruins and 127 Hours. Often people just like stuck in a single place with some kind of threat around them, right? And again, like, those types of movies I find the most stressful of all, where you're just like plonked in one situation and you're stuck there with the characters, right, for like 90 minutes. It's horrific.
It's totally true. And I think what dawned on me for both of these films, actually, is that it's not the fear just of the terrible situation, it's the fear of the heartache. It's a fear of the absolute just torment mentally of being stuck with a few people. Maybe you know them, maybe you don't, And am I going to be alone at the end of this, even if I do manage to survive the longest? It's horrible when you think about it.
It's so grim. It really is. Like I'm fascinated by these movies, and I wonder why, just from a filmmaking perspective, there were so many of them at this time. I was trying to work that out, and I wonder whether they must be quite cheap to make, relatively, right? A lot of these films are like 2 or 3 actors max in a single location, and so that kind of element of it is fairly easy to pull off. But then there must be a lot of challenges to those types of movies too, right? Where you've got to really sustain that pacing for 80, 90 minutes. Like, you know, again, like last week we talked about the film with 3 people in a ski lift. Like, that's it. And like, you know, those sorts of movies, it's like, that's actually a filmmaking challenge in a way, isn't it?
That's so true, isn't it? You're relying a heck of a lot on a very small cast and their sort of interactions, their emotions. It's true. And maybe that's part of why we get so emotionally wrapped up within it, because they're often in real time, aren't they? So we don't have the relief of kind of, we're going to go to a different scene, or we're going to go back or forward in time. You are just literally sitting with a very small group in a really horrible, harrowing situation, wondering, A, what would I do? And B, how the fuck are they going to get out of this? Is there any hope? It's incredibly stressful just talking about it, isn't it?
It really is. It really is. I think that the absolute pinnacle of this is The Descent, right? Like, I think that is the movie where, you know, even monsters aside, it's one of the most harrowing movies ever, just as you see those women descend deeper and deeper and deeper into those caves and get completely stuck and lost. Again, it's just like, it's everyone's worst nightmare, isn't it? That kind of thing, you know?
That's such a clever film, isn't it? Because whenever people say The Descent, and it really is one of my favourite horror films, but the first scene that comes to my mind, despite all of the brilliance with the monsters, the first scene is always her being stuck, thinking she can't. Just that simplicity, right?
Yeah.
Of thinking, I can't move. It's horrible. It's horrible. So it's got you from the start.
The one thing saving grace for me is that I'm like, well, I'm never going to go caving. I'm probably never going to go cage diving or whatever you call it, or swimming in a coral reef by myself. What about you, Juliet? Are you a strong swimmer? Would you do anything like any of these characters in these 2 movies we're about to talk about?
But the irony is, because I don't think of myself as somebody particularly athletic, but actually one of my strengths is swimming. If anything, I'm better at swimming. But I don't think I could, even psychologically, deal with the idea of being on a boat for a long time in the middle of the ocean, because I just think about what's under there, you know, and it isn't even things that could harm me. It's things that just feel really abject and weird, like all of those deep sea creatures and squids and jellyfish. It's terrifying to me.
Grim. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Well, there we go. Well, let's get into these 2 films. They're very, there's a lot of kind of really interesting parallels and interesting differences, I think, between the 2 of them as well. So we'll begin with The Reef from 2010.
What? Something's following us.
Susie, you're freaking me out.
Get back. Oh, it's a shark. How big? It's big. Take some deep breaths with me. Swim.
So The Reef, 2010, a group of friends set sail for a sunny escape off the Australian coast. But when their boat capsizes, the drama rises faster than the waves. Think Home and Away meets Jaws. With unresolved relationship tension simmering, plus a great white shark circling beneath them, they're stranded in open water with no coast in sight. Faced with a sinking wreck of an uncertain swim to safety, the group must decide if their bonds or their nerves are enough to keep them alive.
Oh, beautiful plot synopsis, Juliet. Oh, my God. Yeah, that's really nice. And I loved Home and Away meets Jaws, because we were messaging about this, but there was a real Home and Away vibe to the first 20, 25 minutes of this film, right? I loved it.
Definitely.
For people who don't know, for any, American listeners out there, Home and Away is an Australian soap opera, right? Set in a kind of surfing beach town. And there's just a lot of like beautiful looking people on beaches, isn't there? And a lot of like romances and dramas and that kind of thing. Big when we were growing up, wasn't it, Juliet?
Oh, it was huge. Every day, 5 days a week.
Every day. But this, because it's Australian and because it's set in that kind of location and because it's a little bit, and we'll talk about this, I think this works to its strengths, though. It's a little bit cheap looking. It almost looks a bit televisual, I think, in the way it's filmed. And that first, 15, 20 minutes, it had real Home and Away vibes. I loved it.
It's so true, isn't it? There's something even about the way they look that feels very Home and Away.
Yeah.
But I guess it is that sort of 2000s, style, isn't it?
Exactly. So, just broad thoughts, first of all, Juliet. What did you think of The Reef?
So I'd never seen it before until you asked me to do this. And I have to say, I was really pleasantly surprised.
Yeah.
Like you, first 20 minutes, I thought, oh my God, the script is terrible. I don't like these people. How am I going to care about this film? And then it gets going. Then it does what it does. And I actually think, this is quite a big statement, but I actually think if I had to kind of rate shark films, it's high for me. It's high up there toward the Jaws end. I really do think it's a very, very well-crafted film.
I completely agree. This was the first time watching it for me. Now, I had been told about this film for years. In fact, good friend of the pod, Stevie Webb, has often talked about how it's one of his scariest ever horror films. And I remember we did at the end of 2019, a big roundup of our favourite horror films of the decade. And most people were saying Get Out, Hereditary, The Witch. And then Stevie Webb came in with this Australian movie called The Reef that I'd never heard of. And he said, trust me, it's one of the most nerve-shredding movies ever made. Yes. And so it's kind of been on my radar ever since. So I was really glad to finally watch it. And I agree with you completely. This is, for me, one of the great shark horror movies. Obviously it's not Jaws. Nothing compares to Jaws. But in terms of just sheer terror... Mm-hmm. And I sort of mean this in the best possible way. I couldn't wait for it to end because I was so stressed watching it. I just kind of wanted it. I wanted to know that either they were going to live or they were going to die, but I needed it to be over because it was almost like excruciating tension throughout the kind of second and third acts of this film.
Yeah, there's a few films that I could list, probably. Only about 5 that really physically get to me. And this was one of them where, like you said, you want it to end so you can breathe. You want it to end so you can just be like, I need my body to calm down. I need my nervous system to calm down.
Well, usually as well, shark movies tend to have quite a light, frothy tone, right? Whether it's Deep Blue Sea or The Meg or, Sharknado, whatever it might be. These movies often don't take themselves too seriously. So it feels almost quite rare these days to watch a film like The Reef, which... It's sort of based on a true story, and it is taking its subject matter deadly seriously, isn't it? It's very earnest, this film.
It is, and I think, we'll probably get into it later, but the thing that I think is actually its real strength is it doesn't try to villainize the shark. It doesn't try to turn it into any kind of monster with a narrative. It is literally 4 people in the ocean being kind of subject to things that are bigger than them and curious about them. It's as simple as that. And that makes it very, very real.
Yeah, completely agree. I think that's what it is. It feels, we'll talk about this as we go, but the way it's filmed, again, that kind of low budget filmmaking, it really does feel like we are there.
Yes.
Dropped into this location. We're not on a studio backlot, anything like that. It really feels like these people are in genuine danger when we're watching it, It's quite clever filmmaking in that regard.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think when you asked me to watch 47 Meters Down as the kind of other film for this podcast, it's actually a really perfect bookend because it's the complete opposite. 47 feels glossy. Yes. It feels like a film that's been made that you recognise. You're totally right in that The Reef does actually kind of feel like a docudrama. It almost has a found footage feel without needing the camera, which is really clever.
Really clever. It kind of feels unsafe almost. Yes. And I that's how I felt the whole way through. I felt unsafe. I felt stressed and unsafe, which is, I think, exactly what the film wanted me to feel. So I think it's pretty tremendous. How do you find this direction? It's directed by Andrew Traucki, I think, who had previously made an alligator film called Blackwater, which, again, I've not seen. a lot of people tell me is excellent and also really scary as well, kind of set in a swamp. So clearly he's very good at this kind of thing. But you just mentioned it briefly already, but just tell me again a little bit about what you think of kind of the cinematography and the kind of the general look and vibe of this film, I suppose.
Well, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because it is that home and away thing where, because it doesn't feel glossy, it doesn't feel like a film. It feels as if somebody just literally does have a camera and happens to be observing these people.
Yeah.
What it means is that you are, as I say, going in real time with them. And also it gives this real sort of grainy, for want of a better word, bite to it.
Yeah.
Where you genuinely do, I think you said it a second ago perfectly, you don't feel safe. You don't feel that there is any kind of safety net or ridiculous kind of Hollywood gimmick that's going to save them within this situation. And there's that brilliant thing that he does where, if I'm right in kind of what I've read about how he approached this film, is that he filmed the sharks first. So he went off into the ocean, kind of used some bait just to get some footage of some tiger sharks, and then built the narrative around it. So rather than kind of looking for shots to fit his narrative, he used them in a way where he then didn't have to rely on having to manipulate them in any way. And what that does is it makes it feel real. When we do see the sharks, it's brief. They look angry, but they don't look like they're being sort of made up in any way to resemble anything other than a beast that is much quicker and faster and smarter than you in this environment.
Completely agree. Yeah, I think that's so right. So like we've mentioned, this was filmed entirely on location, I think in Queensland, right? And they essentially, that's right, the director went and got a bunch of shots of real shark, and they had all these different techniques. They just they stuck a camera like on a stick basically, and then they threw loads of, shark food, like guts or whatever, into the water. And then as a shark approached, they just stuck the camera on a stick under the water and got as many shots as possible. Apparently at one point, I think the camera even got chomped by a shark as well, and they nearly lost some of their filming equipment. But they really did get that close to the sharks' mouths, and they were just swimming around them. So yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. I think the way that he then backwards engineered the scares to work with the existing footage he already had works so well. And then how they filmed the actual the rest of it is they're just off the beach, right? I don't know if you've seen, there's behind the scenes footage where they've walked about 10 feet out of the beach into the sea. So they're still basically waist deep, but they're just filming everything away from the beach so that we're not pointing towards the shore. And I can't believe, it's amazing, isn't it? How convincing that actually looks, because you never know, to watch it looks like they are in the middle of nowhere. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, definitely. At no point in my mind am I thinking, oh, they're close to the shore. You really do believe they're in the deep ocean. My only criticism is that there are times, I think, when they stop, probably because they are close to the shore, their kind of shoulders are above the waterline. And I think because they're knackered, and you would, as an actor, you probably would be feeling like this, but they kind of stop looking like they're treading water. So there were a couple of moments where I was like, you are in shallow water. It looks like you're not,
you're
but
just standing. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. I imagine that must be quite hard to kind of pretend, actually. If you're able to stand, how do you make it look like you're treading water? But yeah, you're right. Maybe they could have gone just a few feet deeper, for filming some of those moments. But yeah, it is really clever, that kind of low budget filmmaking and the way they pull it off. And I think, again, the actual sharks, they're filmed in a way that I very rarely see in fictional horror films as well, because usually, you're so right about this, what you said about the sharks are usually made out to be villains. They're usually super villains. They're usually actually conniving and scheming, and they're much more monstrous in the way that they might move or pounce or come out of the water to grab somebody or whatever. Whereas actually in this movie, it really takes its time. There are just a lot of scenes, first of all, where the sharks are just swimming around them, right? Or circling them, before. It's not like they just come out of nowhere and grab somebody. It's no, they're just around and we can see them. And that is some of the scariest stuff, I think. That moment when one of our characters first sees a shark under the water and it just comes into focus in the kind of murky, dark water. It's absolutely terrifying because it's not even doing anything at that point, but it's just around, right? It's just nearby, and that threat just never lets up from that point onwards,
And that's exactly it. It's the curiosity that I pick up on from the shark, rather than it having any particular motive to decide to go and attack these people. It almost reminds me of... So I've had dogs all my life, and that thing where a dog is curious about something, and of course the only thing that it has to explore is its mouth. So it starts to kind of tentatively pick up something or shake it. And I can remember taking the dog out for a walk, and he had run after a rabbit, and I desperately didn't want him to kill this rabbit. He didn't want to kill it. He actually kind of jumped up and ran off as soon as he actually got it in his mouth. But it was this thing of just sort of realizing my dog doesn't want to kill you.
No.
But its instinct is to do this. And it's that feeling like, oh my God, that must be what it feels like if you're being chased by a shark, where you are just an object of curiosity to them.
Absolutely. And of course, I know that this has been a real thing in terms of like animal activists and that kind of thing have kind of spoken out about like stop portraying sharks as such monsters, right? Because it's encouraged like off the back of films like Jaws has actually encouraged people to kind of kill sharks and that kind of thing, and this kind of reputation they have for being this like deadly thing that's going to kill us. Actually, there's a really, 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 really slim chance, I think, that a shark is actually going to attack you, let alone eat you, right?
Yeah.
But I think you feel that in this movie. Like you said, the shark is curious. It's circling them. It's kind of prodding them a couple of times first. And it's only then, as shit starts to hit the fan, that it starts to actually eat people. But it doesn't really matter, because just knowing it's there and then seeing those characters panic almost to the point of... One of those characters, one of the girls, almost looks like she's going into a full attack, like a panic attack, right? Hyperventilating. That in itself is terrifying, isn't it?
Okay. It's a shark. How big? It's big. It's all right. Come together.
One of the most effective moments in the film for me is, I think it's only our kind of hero, Luke, that has seen it, because he's the only one with the goggles, which is another really clever move. There's only one pair of goggles between them, right?
Yes.
So he's seen it, but you can feel him kind of going, okay, I need to tell them, but I also want to keep them calm. So I'm going to say it's here, but we just need to keep going. You then start to see the kind of ripple of fear going through the rest of the group. And then there's just one moment before anybody's been attacked where it just kind of brushes against the side all of a sudden. You see its fin. You know the bit I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh my God. It is that, I think, is what sets Susie off into this kind of panic attack. And it's just so relatable. And your instinct feels to sort of be like, don't panic because it's going to make it worse. Well, is it going to make it worse? I've got no idea. Like, does it make a difference at this point? It's horrible.
God, it is horrible. Yeah. Well, let's rewind for a second and talk about these characters. Like we mentioned how the first kind of 15, 20 minutes feels very soapy. And this and 47 Meters Down, this is a bit of a trait of these movies, I think, that it's got like a finite amount of time to set up everything we need to know about the characters, yes. Right? So it's like bare bones. There's probably a relationship. There's probably a breakup. There's probably maybe a rivalry or something. And it's like, boom, that's all you need to know. Now we get on with it kind of thing. But how did you find it? Like you said, our main character of Luke. And then I think it's Kate, who is, yes. I think his ex-girlfriend, right? And these friends that are kind of, and she's got a brother, Matt, as well. And then his girlfriend, Susie. And then you've got Warren, I think, who is the man on the boat who stays behind. Exactly, who stays behind. But yeah, what did you think of the kind of the character setup in this movie?
I find it really funny. I mean, I don't think that the dialogue is particularly the strength of this movie. No. And you're totally right. It's with all of these films, there's this sort of expectation that we need to have real kind of value in the relationships and the exposition behind these characters. Actually, we don't, like if I was sitting next to the bus driver and suddenly I was stuck in sharp water, I'm going to feel a lot for that bus driver, right? Like it doesn't matter. This is a horrible situation. So I do find it really funny that they start with this setup where we're supposed to really think about the are they, aren't they love relationship between Kate, isn't it? Kate and Luke. And this hilarious bit where, in order, as you say, to kind of rush this exposition through, she hands him a giant sausage.
Yeah. Yeah. Have a
And it's
sausage.
supposed to be, have a sausage. Oh, right, you had sex. That's a little joke. Okay, we get it. And in my head, because I'm so used to these things, right, I'm like, oh, this is totally Chekhov's sausage, right? Like, this is going to...
Chekhov's sausage. I think I've seen that film.
It's very expensive.
Yeah.
But it's like totally a motive that's going to mean something, and then it's like, oh no, it really doesn't. That literally was there just to tell us they've had sex.
Oh,
it's
so
really funny.
Good. It's so good. Yeah, it's so funny that, isn't it? You're right. This pretense of let's all try and care about these characters before we get into it. And again, I wonder if that is a slight product of, again, such a brilliant example of this, The Descent, right? The Descent is such a genius example of that film because it builds up such a beautiful portrayal of these women and the relationships, the affairs, the rivalries, the secrets and lies and everything, and it does that in such a wonderful way before we then get into the shit, right? But it feels like all of these kind of slightly cheaper movies have tried to do the same thing, but just like slightly half-assed, you know?
Really half-assed, really kind of rushed through. You can almost feel the actors being embarrassed of the dialogue.
Yeah.
It's really funny.
Yeah, really funny. And but again, I will forgive it because there's something about it that, again, could almost feel more like real life because these are, they almost don't feel like movie stars, the people in this. They don't really feel like, even though it is a bit soapy, it also kind of feels like like you said, there's a found footage vibe almost, or something like we could just be looking at like just normal people interacting in a way, right? So again, there is something weirdly, even though there is that kind of slight cheesiness, with that, there is a kind of weird authenticity, I think, you know?
I think that's a really good point. And there's also, I mean, actually, where it does get me, ironically, because it's sort of the one they didn't put any work into in terms of the dialogue, is just knowing that she is that their siblings, that Matty, who is the first one to die, is her brother.
Yes.
And also, you know, they don't really go into the relationship between Matty and Susie, but you feel it. It's horrific, the idea of her having to carry on knowing that her husband or boyfriend is now dead. Like it's
horrible. It's horrible.
That stuff really works. Yeah,
it really works. I you know, that's the thing. I was kind of like slightly laughing at the performances in that first act, and then actually I completely ate my words when they are stuck and stranded. The portrayal and the performances from that point onwards are so real. Like the panic, I was with them every step of the way. In the panic, in the sadness of losing people, of just the sheer like disorientation. Like I think it's actually amazing. The performances are amazing actually for the bulk of this film. Yeah,
they're really human. That's something I observed. I thought I'm impressed. I don't know whether it's the direction or it's the choices that the actors made, but they're really human. I think there's one point where I think it's after that scene where the shark is brushed up that I was talking about earlier, and Kate just stops. Like she just freezes, and she's got this look of absolute unbelief, you know, a shutdown of terror while Susie is screaming hysterically. And I thought, fuck, that's real. That's what would happen. You know, that's what delivers the punch.
Completely agree. Yeah, that's how I would be.
Yeah.
What would you have done? Because they have the characters face this choice, right? And we never quite know, do we? Like, what exactly happened? Something flipped their boat over, right? So they're all on this yacht, and then there is this almighty crash, and it flips upside down, and a lot of them get stuck underneath it, and they all have to work their way back up onto the roof. Or onto the base, I guess, but upside down. It's a kind of Poseidon type deal. And they then have to make a decision. They're like, we're stranded in the middle of the ocean. Either we wait for rescue to come, but we could face just dying of dehydration, right? Or this boat will sink. Or we could try and swim to shore, but it's about 12 miles and there are God knows what lurking under the ocean, right? And there's a horrible decision that they have to make. And eventually they decide all but one are going to go for it and swim. And this one guy stays completely by himself in the yacht, on the roof of the yacht, and we never see him again. I was trying to work out what I would do in that situation. I think I would be tempted to just stay on the boat, to be honest.
I think that is one of the best scenes in the movie, because my instinct as all of that takes place is, why are they not just staying? Why are they not just staying? It's too early to make this decision. Mm-hmm. And then I think what really works about it, because I don't know, but I think maybe kind of, 4 in 5 people are going to say the same as us. I'm going to stay on the boat. But if everybody else was leaving and you were the last one. That moment where Kate says, I'm going to stay, and then she just can't. She sees them swimming off and says, no, I'm going to come.
Yes.
I think that's what I would end up doing out of nothing but fear of being alone through this.
Totally.
And we never know with Warren. You're right. We never know with him whether he did survive this or not. In my head, he dies, but you don't know. There's no conclusion to his story, is there?
Well, there's that really bleak caption at the end. It's such a bleak film because at the very end, it just ends with a caption saying, the man and the boat was never found, basically, in like the real life story, right? Like that guy died, basically. Yep. And it's like, we didn't even see what happened to him. So yeah, the correct decision, I guess, in a way, was to go off and swim. But I think you're right. I think 4 or 5 at least people, I think everything in our instinct would go, no, why would I do that when I can just stay on this boat, right?
Exactly.
God, it's, again, I say, I will never go into the ocean on, like, let's just not do it,
Agreed. Happily. Agreed.
I tell you what, though, and this is another lovely thing about these sorts of films, is that there is a beauty with the danger, right? And actually, as soon as you start filming on location off the coast of Queensland in Australia, and of course, like, part of filming in an outdoor location means that most of it has to be filmed in the daylight. It looks gorgeous, doesn't it? I mean, that's the thing about, these types of movies is that actually, because I remember that I read that the tourist board in Queensland were worried that this could have a negative impact on tourism. But in a way, it also makes that place look absolutely beautiful, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's really clever for that reason, isn't it? It's so idyllic. And I think there was a really heartbreaking something I read from the guy that the story is actually inspired by. So it's actually the guy called Ray. Is it Ray Bradbury? No, that's a writer.
It is. Ray Boundy.
Boundy, that's it. Who actually was the survivor, who with 3 friends that had literally just decided they were going to go out and fish for prawns. The boat had capsized. I don't think in the same way that it does in the movie, but something had happened where they were in the same predicament. They had to decide whether to stay on this upturned boat or to, in their case, I think, try and swim back to shore. And he said this really heartbreaking thing where there was a chunk of time when it was fine and they were just swimming back to the coast. And this is echoed in the movie as well when they make, again, it's written really badly where he says, I think Matty says, oh, if I need to get through something, I just think about sex at the gym, and they all kind of giggle.
Yeah.
And I think that's what this bit is sort of, this moment of kind of like, actually, maybe we're going to be fine. And look, this is really beautiful and it's going to be hard work, but we can do this and we're together. And then it's not okay. Mm-hmm. It's such a weird juxtaposition, that beauty, and then this horror that I think films like this, captures stunningly.
Yeah, they just perfect it, don't they? I think it's done. Again, it's not an easy thing to pull off. Like, this kind of level of horror in the middle of the daytime, in the middle of a wide open space. Like, usually we expect horror to be the opposite, right? We think of claustrophobic dark spaces, haunted houses, whatever. Mm-hmm. And it's a real feat, I think, to pull this off, where you're just in this really stunningly beautiful location in the middle of the day, like, to still make that as terrifying as it is quite impressive. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a genuine, and I suppose 47 meters down is going to tap into this even more, but it's a genuine common phobia as well, isn't it? And I've had guests talk about this before, but that fear of kind of the open space, like the open water beneath your feet, that idea of like not knowing what's beneath you as well. I guess both these movies kind of tap into that really well.
Mm-hmm. I think I have that a little bit without even really knowing. It's this anything where there's a sense of, I mean, I can remember standing at the top of the Empire State Building in New York and looking down and seeing all of these little taxi lights and thinking, God, every single taxi light that I can see, there's at least one human being in there, and all of their hopes and their dreams and their worries and their wants, they're right there. And there's millions of them. So how insignificant can all of those things be for me if I'm up here? And there is something about, it's often why I, within my own work, paint kind of things from deep sea creatures and squids. There is something about this idea of being so tiny in a huge vastness that just existentially, I really tie myself up in knots, and it's a proper fear for me.
Absolutely, I agree with you. And I guess there is a real similarity. We talked about this before between ocean and space. Like, they kind of tick the same box in horror. I think especially 47 meters down, that feels reminiscent of like Gravity or something, like the movie Gravity, right? Where you've just got two people stranded floating around, you know, and there is something so terrifying about both the ocean and space, where you just think, like, I am just a blip. I'm just like a speck of dust here in something that's so much bigger and more powerful than me. Yeah. So with these sorts of movies, I always find, like we've talked about it before, but that challenge of how do you keep up that pacing? Like, how do you make that tension last 90 minutes and it not feel at any point like it's dragging or whatever? How do you find it as the kind of horror kicks off and we've got our four survivors start getting picked off? Like, do you think it really sustains that tension all the way up until the end?
I think it does a pretty good job, actually, considering that it's, where it's going at this point. You know, most of these films, you're expecting people to be picked off one by one, but at no point does it let up that tension. You know, and I found myself, even though I knew that the likelihood of there being more than one survivor was very small, that's not how these films operate, I found myself desperately wanting there to be hope for each of those chapters before somebody died. And I think to make you feel like that is difficult. It means that the director and the actors and the production is doing its job to keep it so taut and so on the edge of actually being able to beat this thing that you still keep wanting it, even though you know it's not going to happen. And I think the only thing where I feel like, not so much that the tension drops, because I think the tension is still there, but that I got frustrated is when they're sort of close to the end and they're resting because they finally found a rock. And I'm like, no, just go to that other rock, because why are you wasting time?
Oh my God, I know. It's that moment of relief, but then also this moment of, oh God, like, I know what the language of cinema is telling me here. It's that they're fucked, actually. Like, as soon as you think they've got a moment of respite, that means they definitely haven't. And there's this moment of, they just wake up and there's just a rock, then there's an island there, and you're like, oh my God, we're saved. And it's like, nope, of course they're not. And then we get that, and I agree, I think the movie does a really good job of sustaining that tension, that pacing, spacing out how they kill off each person one by one. Each one is as horrific as the last. That kind of disorientation of drifting off to sleep and then waking up and then seeing the land, but not quite knowing how that is there and why, is in itself quite interesting and creepy. I think that, again, this kind of the unknowability of the ocean, right? The current is just taking them wherever, and actually, where the fuck are they by the end of the film as well, right? You know?
And even if you get to the rock, you know, it's not the end of your problems, is it? It's like you're not on the shore. Exactly. Nobody knows you're there. It's just another problem.
Oh my God. And then, of course, and I knew this was going to happen, but the moment when they get to the rock, and of course, one of them has to get chomped at that very last minute, right, as well. And that's horrific, because then you've just got that one survivor. It's just Kate left by herself, isn't it, by the end? Which, again, is like worst case scenario, I think, for anyone as a human being, I think, right?
Well, that's it. Yeah. You know, imagine you've been through this. You've watched three people you're close to die horrifically. You've managed to kind of get to this rock. Now you're just sat alone on this rock, hoping that somebody is going to come and save you before you, I don't know, starve or dehydrated to death. Yeah. And even then you're dealing with this horrific trauma. I mean, there is no win to this scenario, is there?
No. And again, the film does not give a shit about that. Like, you don't get any of the kind of the end of a slasher movie where the final girl gets put into the back of an ambulance with a blanket over her and she's going to be okay. It's like, no, she gets onto that rock, end. Like, we get a caption saying no one else lived, the guy on the boat probably died. And then the credits roll, and I was like, fucking hell.
Brutal. Absolutely fucking brutal.
Absolutely brutal. I would say it's like the feel-bad film of the decade in some ways, this movie.
Exactly.
But, you know, I was also kind of relieved that it was over at the same time. I like took a breath, you know.
Right with you, Mike.
Oh my God. So there you go. I mean, like, how you kind of mentioned this at the top, actually, but I was going to finish by asking you just kind of how it compares to other shark movies for you. But by the sounds of it, it ranks pretty high.
I think it really does. The more I chew on it, pun intended, the more I think, actually, it really stays with me. And even just talking about it, I get those little kind of tinges of anxiety. And I think that's pretty something for a shark movie. It's a good one.
I agree. I agree. I think it's really like, despite its limitations, clearly a very, very low budget film and working with actual, like, the ocean and actual animals, I think it's really masterfully put together. I think the editing, actually, like, I kept noticing the editing and how good that was in terms of, like, the sharks kind of, swimming at us or jumping past, and sometimes it was almost a blink and you'll miss it moment, and it all felt very real and very traumatizing for that exact reason. Yeah, that, like, actually in some ways the footage resembles some of those YouTube shark attack videos that you watch, right? So it's a really lovely mix of kind of like you said, kind of documentary and fiction, I think. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I can imagine actually as an editor you can see it in a slightly different way, because it wasn't until after I'd seen the film and learnt that he'd sort of, as you say, backpedaled or orchestrated the footage around it after it was made, that you're right, because I'm not even aware of the editing, which is a good sign, right? Yeah. Like, that means it's gone well.
There she is, the almost birthday girl. Oh, but it seems I wore my long legs today. What happens if
That, of course, could only be the dulcet tones of Nicolas Cage in Longlegs, one of the biggest and most talked about horror films of 2024. And that is exactly what we were talking about earlier this week on Patreon, some of the biggest and best horror films of 2024. Over on Patreon, we released our Fresh Blood End of Year special, in which we counted down our top 24 horror films of 2024. That was our combined top. Me, Brad, Steph and Becky, we all submitted our top 10s, our top 15s in fact, and we combined them all and came up with our collated top 24. Some really great titles in there. What a strong year for horror it's been. So if you want to hear what was our collective number one, was it Longlegs? Was it The Substance? Or was it something else? Give it a listen. Head on over to patreon.com/evolution of horror. We also had a little look forward at what movies are due to come out in 2025, and there is quite the slate. There's a lot of treats and there's a lot of truly bad stuff coming out this year. So yeah, it was a really fun discussion. You can listen to that whole special episode if you are a $5 donor. $5 per month on Patreon will get you access to our monthly Fresh Blood Strand, as well as mailbag episodes and other bonus content. $10 per month will get you access to our exclusive mini-seasons, including our found footage mini-series, which kicks off next week. Cannot wait. Everybody who signs up, no matter what tier, will also get a little shout out on the main podcast as a thank you. Speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the month of November a little thanks. So a big thank you to Chris, Adam Woods, Smixies, Lil Venskus, Ali, Patrick Pruitt, Jordan Palmer, Joanne Seddon, James Hibbert, Katie, Gary Jaff, Dan Hinchcliffe, Kayla, Matt, Ian Forbes, The Gauntlet, Janelle Eaglin, James, Louis Aroniz, Ralph, Andrew, Brian Harpring, Sarah Wilson, DJ Haggins, Claire Verney, Jerry Lopez, Distant Earth, Ian B, Jacob Knights, Charlie Ann Horton, Paul Harris, Simone and Jack. A huge thank you to all of those people for signing up to our Patreon. And one more time, if you want to join them and get treated to regular bonus content and more, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode, in which Juliet Sugg and I discuss 47 Meters Down from 2017.
Oh my god, this is amazing! Jeez! What was that? What? Oh my god! What's going on? Where's the gate? Help! I have to get out of here! I can't breathe! I can't breathe! How deep are we? 47 meters. I'm so scared. We have to get back up to the top.
47 metres down. After her boyfriend calls her boring, Lisa decides the ultimate clapback is diving into a rusty shark cage with her sister, because proving a point is worth risking life, limb, and common sense. When the cage snaps and plummets to the ocean floor, the sisters face dwindling air, hungry sharks, because nothing says good decisions like tripping underwater. A tense, jaw-clenching thriller where reality, like the oxygen supply, is seriously questionable.
Very good. Yes. I mean, absolutely. We talked about the kind of the authenticity of the Reef. This movie very much feels like a Hollywood movie, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's the opposite. Actually, it's more restrained than it could have been. You know, it could have really gone bonkers. And actually, I think there is some good uses of realism. And if you just let go any idea of what's likely to be real, then you can have a really good time with this film.
I agree. I mean, I think it's still great, actually. I found it more effective than I expected to find it. And again, this was a first-time watch for me. I've got to say that, generally speaking, I've never been one to rush to the cinema to watch a new shark survival movie, personally. Like, it's not my subgenre of choice, despite the fact that I spent the last year doing these movies. And I've missed out on so many of these recent ones from the last 10, 20 years I am watching for the first time. And again, I thought this movie was as stressful and traumatizing and jumpy as the film wanted it to be, right? Like, I found it pretty effective in what it was doing. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this film is the definition of a ghost train horror film, isn't it? It literally is strap yourself in. Your body's going to be forced to jump. You're going to laugh at times, but you're also going to feel shit. You're going to feel stressed. And I thought, reading the reviews afterwards, I thought this has been unfairly hacked at, actually. I think it's a decent little horror film that you can have a good time with. Yeah,
that's interesting. I wonder why. Is there a bit of snob? I mean, I would say that critically, there's always been a bit of snobbery about shark movies. I think that and I've probably been guilty of this too, but I think the instinct is you imagine it to be B-movie schlock. Like, I imagine it to be a Sharknado, The Meg, which I hated. I imagine all shark movies to be a bit like that, to be a bit cheap and cheesy. And this movie is cheesy, but it's doing what it's doing really well. And I agree. I don't think it deserves the slight critical negativity that it got, because I think as a genre exercise, it's great.
Yeah, I mean, I think if somebody handed this to you and said, I've tried to make a quick 90-minute thriller.
Yeah.
You'd be impressed. You'd go, yeah, good job, well done.
Absolutely, yeah. So we'd sort of mentioned this already, but the Reef that was filmed very much in kind of like off the cuff, getting real footage of sharks and in the ocean. This movie, like you mentioned, almost the complete opposite. This was filmed in a big studio in a water tank, right? Everything under very, very controlled circumstances. I think there's quite a lot of CGI in this movie compared to the Reef, right? How do you find that? How do you find the general kind of look and vibe of this film?
Do I don't mind it. I think from the moment it opens, it feels to me like a lot of other films in the 2000s. It has a gloss, but it's also not trying to do anything particularly interesting in terms of its cinematography. It's absolutely fine. I kind of like that where your foot is.
Yeah.
You know what you're kind of in for. It works for me.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, it's funny because we talk about this as a 2000s film, but this is 2017. This is actually
good point.
Fairly recent. This was coming out in the same year that we were getting films like Get Out and Hereditary, which is quite amazing because it does feel more of a different era, actually, doesn't it? It feels more like a movie that could have come out in 2007 in some ways. Yeah.
I wonder if that's part of the criticism, because that's when I hadn't thought about it, but you're right. We were getting these kind of really interesting, quite deep, complicated horror films. And then this little film that says, I just want to scare you.
Yeah.
Exactly. As a shark film.
Exactly. It was almost like we weren't quite... As an audience, we weren't quite in the mood for those types of films or something at this point in time. I don't know. But yeah, there is a kind of, like you say, where we're at. I mean, I say that, actually. I say that, audiences didn't embrace it. It did make a lot of money. It wasn't critically acclaimed, but from a $5 million budget, it made over 60 million. So actually, it did do really well.
There you go.
In terms of audiences. But yeah, I think, like you say, exactly where you are when this movie starts. And even the cast, casting like Mandy Moore. There's something in that who isn't there in terms of like, I don't know, the tone that it's going for and the audience maybe that it's aiming for. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. It's a nice little sort of footing for her, isn't it? Because it's not doing anything that's going to rock the boat. I keep making these terrible puns without intending. But there's nothing sort of too controversial in there for her, but it's getting her to do some grown-up stuff and some kind of brewy stuff.
Yes.
It makes total sense to me.
I agree. So this time, instead of Australia, we're in Mexico, right? We've got Lisa and Kate on vacation in Mexico. It's funny, as we're recording this, my wife is on holiday in Mexico with some of her friends, and I've just been watching all these movies about mainly girls going on holiday to Mexico and then awful things happening to them. So she was like, we're on a beach right now just chilling, and I was like, watch out for sharks, don't go cage diving. And then she was like, we're going to go visit a Mayan temple tomorrow, and I was like, I just watched the ruins, be careful, like hilarious. So and again we get this hilarious kind of first act, don't we, of what is the deal again? It's like Lisa's boyfriend broke up with her, right? And so the two of them are kind of on a trip getting over that, I think, right?
Oh, it's so bad. Yeah, the two sisters, they've gone on this holiday. She hasn't mentioned to her sister until I think the first night that her boyfriend dumped her because she was too boring. And the other sister is, exciting and flirty and has all these adventures. And so she's like, okay, we're gonna really turn things around. I'm gonna make you wild. It's super cheesy.
It's so good. And of course they meet two handsome men out there, and it's those men, right, that are like, hey, we're going to take you cage diving in the ocean.
Never trust a man called Javier who takes you to a rusty cage.
Yeah. Honestly. And I think, it's a funny thing. They don't really dwell on this, but I guess the implication is that they are going slightly like, they're not going with a kind of excursion that has been recommended by the resort, right? This is like slightly off the beaten track boat trip. So they almost like these people are slightly dodgy, right? These people on the boat. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm visiting my folks at the moment, and I made my dad watch this, and he was so angry that they got on the boat. He was so like, well, why would you do that? You can tell. That's the whole point of the movie, Dad. We know it's going to go wrong. He was furious.
Yes, exactly. Furious. This is the thing. I again, I say, well, I would never have done this in the first place. I would never even got on that boat, But but I think straight away you get that idea that this is a glossy, almost like teen horror film, and so in some ways it feels more sort of safe, I guess, than The Reef. Like it didn't feel as kind of heart-stoppingly dangerous to me. However, the film is still quite bold, actually, with what it puts these characters through, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it properly tortures them. And saying to you sort of earlier with The Reef that kind of physical experience that I had with it, there were moments within this when I had a similar thing. I could feel myself holding my breath or just thinking about the kind of psychology of it. So there is a depth. God, another bad pun. There is a
depth of 47 meters, you might say, to this movie. I
don't know if I'd say 47, maybe 25.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing. There's an added threat to this, isn't there? So they go into the cage, they get lowered down, and already there is peril in every sense, because what you've got now is they're underwater, they're running out of oxygen. So that happens throughout the whole movie, is that the oxygen is running out. They can't just swim straight up to the surface because of the bends as well, right? Which has always terrified me. I don't know why. Like, I remember first being told about the bends as a kid, and just whole idea of that sounding absolutely terrifying to me. Where, like, if you swim up from too deep a level, then it's gonna nitrogen's gonna get to your brain, and you're gonna bleed out of your ears and eyes or something. I don't know, but just sounds awful, doesn't it? So it's not just sharks in this movie, is it? That's the thing. We've also got, there are so many other kind of elements to contend with in this.
Yeah, and to be honest, when I look back at the film, the sharks don't play that big a part in this film. Right?
No, barely at all, to be honest.
Not a lot, is there? And a lot of the kind of the tension and the horror comes from just being in these masks, in these, you know, the lack of oxygen and a fear of the bends, which apparently is... it's very unlikely that they would have had any serious side effects. They could have just swam up. I love this.
Oh, really? Amazing.
But I mean, that's where the tension comes from. It's less to do with them being stalked by a shark.
Mm-hmm.
The sharks are a bit inconsequential. They just happen to be around.
I think one of the slight consequences of this film, which I think is a bit of a shame, is because the whole thing takes place underwater and they're wearing scuba gear, you can't see the actresses' faces throughout the whole film, basically. So then you're relying entirely on voices. They're talking to each other via a kind of microphone type thing almost, right? And then kind of physical acting. So it's kind of interesting. There's not many other films like that where it's almost like silent movie acting in what the two of them have to do, right? It's kind of like you've got, on the one hand, they're communicating to each other via a microphone, but we can't see them ever talk or see their faces. We're just watching their bodies as well. So there's a slight disconnect, I think, isn't there, compared to the close-ups of terror that we get in The Reef, you know?
Yeah, and this is, I think, actually a really good point, because although that makes it sound like a negative, I actually think there's probably a lot of credit to be given for what's happening with the sound in 47 meters than we kind of give it credit for. And it is completely the opposite. You know, The Reef, like I said, those moments of just pure horror on their faces, we don't get that. So we're relying on these two actresses to just talk about terror.
Yeah.
And actually, you know, that's not an easy thing to do. So, and I really did have quite sort of physical reactions to things like, you know, when she has to swim out to look for she decides, stupidly, I think, to swim after the lights that she can see in the distance that turns out to be, I can't remember, do they find it? It's one of the rescue team they think is coming, don't they? So they're
do they think it's Javier or somebody?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Something like that. And she swims out of the reef and she's got this kind of losing more and more of her connection to her sister. I mean, that genuinely actually gets to me, this idea of, again, maybe it's this fear of open spaces, but the kind of just vastness of nothing.
Oh my God.
Are the sharks around? And she's losing more and more connection to the only person who's witnessing this horrific event.
Yeah.
In real time with her. It's actually really unnerving.
Completely agree. That moment is horrifying, where she gets to the rock to find the flashlight, and then there's just that moment, isn't there, when she looks in every direction, and everywhere you look it's just darkness, like a void, and she starts to panic and hyperventilate. And I think you're right, actually. Probably more so than The Reef, this movie has to rely on sound design. And there's a lot of breathing. And again, because you're so aware that they've got a finite amount of oxygen, that in itself is stressful, because they're constantly like the whole time. It's like watching the Blair Witch Project, right? Yes, and I was like, I was just like, calm your fucking breathing down. You know, like, again, everything about every decision they made in this was so stressful, you know?
Right. It's one long asthma attack, isn't it? It's absolutely terrifying. Yeah.
God. Yeah. And that's horrible. That's a real claustrophobic element to this film too, knowing that they are slowly running out of oxygen. I think the film is very effective, again, in the fact that you can't see their faces or anything, but you really feel that, right, as they start to run out of air as we get towards the third act. You know, it's horrible.
Exactly.
And again, you say to yourself, I don't know what would be the easiest way to die at this point. Like, shall I let myself suffocate? Shall I just let myself get eaten by a shark? Shall I try and swim to the top and my brain will bleed? I don't know. Like, at this point, I'd just be working out what's the easiest way to die. You know?
I mean, that's it, isn't it? And it's really good at being like, you think it's got as bad as it could be, and they'll add something extra. Like, it falls even further, doesn't it? The cage goes even further than its original drop. Or the moment when she gets her leg trapped underneath it, and you're just like, I would seriously give up at this point.
It's a lost cause, exactly. And I think, again, like, this movie has a lot more of the traditional, like you say, haunted house scares. Like, the moment when she gets to that rock and she goes under it, and then the shark is like coming through the gap in the rock, right, and is trying to chomp down on her. Like, the shark is a bit more kind of malevolent and a bit more evil in this, I think, isn't it, as well?
It's really funny. I think I texted you after I'd seen this, where I'd gone down this kind of rabbit hole of watching different Shark Attack YouTube films and shark expert advice. And there was a guy, shout out to him, I think he was called Shark Bites with a Y, which is a good handle.
Amazing, yeah.
And he's a shark biologist, and he was absolutely cackling with laughter, saying, where does it come from, this idea of sharks like bashing things, like trying to get into rocks? He's like, they don't do that. They can't do that.
No.
They're not like dogs, you know?
I know, it's so funny. What I would imagine is that they would probably just like, oh, that thing I was trying to eat just disappeared. I'll just be on my way then. I'll just swim off. Like, exactly. I can't imagine that they would be like, yeah, exactly, trying to like smash with their heads through a rock in order to get to this one little human. Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, it's so good. But I think all that stuff, again, like in a really fun genre movie way, I think all of it really works. Like, I was fully into it, this stuff, you know?
Yeah. Just got to let go into it, haven't you? And I think then you're going to have a great time.
And then what did you think of this final act and the twist we get, right? Because as you mentioned, you know, there's all these different attempts, and then the cage plummets even further, and then one gets her leg stuck under, and then another, I think it's Kate, swims off, right? And then ends up basically getting chomped by the shark, but we're not entirely sure. And then there's a whole section of the film that comes after that where Lisa is talking to Kate. Kate is still alive, and she's talking to her via the microphone, and Lisa needs to find her, and then the two of them find each other, and they swim upwards, and there are loads of sharks circling them, and they've got their flares. It looks a bit like The Descent, right? There's like a kind of red lighting, and it looks very unrealistic in a way, and I was like, oh, this is quite funny. But then I was really fooled by the reveal that was all a dream or vision, right? Again, it did a very Descent thing there. And actually, Lisa, Mandy Moore's character, was just lying with her leg trapped under that cage the entire time, right? That's grim.
I mean, I actually think that's really smart in retrospect as well, when I look back at it, because I felt like they kept going on about the bends. They kept going on about... We haven't even talked about the fact that Matthew Modine is in this either, which is brilliant.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely hilarious. But when he says to her, you know, just be careful when you get the next set of oxygen, because people start to hallucinate, et cetera, et cetera. So you're waiting for this. You know it's been dropped into this for a reason. And yeah, I didn't know that it was... Like you, I didn't know that she had gone into this whole hallucination at the end. I genuinely thought all of these things were unveiling. And I was getting really angry because I was going, well, how does she know how to change her oxygen tank over? And how has she suddenly become this really strong swimmer? And it's ridiculous. She's managed to gouge out the eye of the shark.
Yeah.
And that brilliant moment, which is my absolute favourite moment in the whole film, when she's got her sister, she's swimming up to the top, trying not to get the bends. They're in the complete darkness. As you say, they turn the flashlight on. The sharks are just like a cartoon. What's the time, Mr. Wolf? Just like with their mouth open.
I know. It's so good. It's
brilliant.
Good.
It's comedy timing.
It is.
And that made me laugh so much that I was getting more and more angry at the ridiculousness. But then when you realise, oh, she is hallucinating and she is just still down there, I was like, oh, okay, well done. That's quite good.
It was great. And then, of course, like it's not as dark as something like The Descent. Like, they do still then rescue her, but only her, right? So like that is kind of sad that basically it ends with her getting away, but her sister is dead, right? And it's like, fair play to this film that I thought was going to be a much kind of safer and cheesier than that, you know?
Yeah, it's got a nasty little, you know, again, stupid pun, but it's got a nasty bite. You didn't expect them to go that far. So yeah, I was impressed.
Okay, now comes the part of the episode where we thank our Kickstarter backers for helping us to create Final Cut, the official Evolution of Horror card game. And this is the last week I'm going to do this because I have finally will have reached the end of my list. This is the final 36, I believe, names on our list of Kickstarter backers. I started thanking people back in episode 1. It's taken 30 weeks of 30 plus thank yous, and we will have finally thanked all 900 plus Kickstarter backers. So it's a big moment. A big thank you to Alex Orlandi, Michael Basham, Michael Prescott, Mika Aki, David Nilsson, Mike Garley, Hannes Carlson, Thomas Watson, Michael Kusek, Carl Lewis, Jacqueline, Andrew Pope, Abby Moore, Tyler, Vanessa, Gion DP, Lorna Slesser, Lai Gang Zing, Zachary, Alan Welsh, Russell Bailey, Sam, Jason Strong, Istvan Russ, Marsack, Nicole Torrens, Emily Bland, Willie Masson, Jorge Manura, General Witchfinders Podcast, Lorna, Brian Davenport, Paul Astbury, Scott Shimahara, Jin Lauter, Richard Rowe, Thu Neogen, Richard Peatfield, Ian M, and Nicholas A.J. Lorenzo. Oh my God. Thank you to all of those people, and thank you to all 908, I believe, Kickstarter backers who helped us to create Final Cut, the official Evolution of Horror card game. Final Cut, thanks to all of you guys, has been manufactured and is now available to buy via our website. So if you want to pick up your copy while stocks last, head on over to evolutionofhorror.com/shop. So, by the way, both of these movies have sequels. Now, I've not seen them. There was The Reef, Stalked, from 2022. And there's also 47 Meters Down, Uncaged as well. Have you seen either of the sequels, Juliet?
I have to sadly tell you, Mike, I have not seen the sequels.
Yeah.
I probably never will.
Nah, I'm not too interested, I've got to say. Again, the critical response to the sequel of 47 Meters Down was very low, was even worse. But then who knows? You know, we said that they were unnecessarily harsh about the first film. But
exactly.
I think with both these films, like, they're really fun. They're a great one-off kind of experience. Again, these aren't the sort of films that I'm going to go back to again and again, you know?
Yeah. And for different reasons, that's what I find interesting. I mean, 47 Meters, I think, is really good popcorn. You know, you're going to have a great time. I think it's a great film to watch with a bunch of people. I think you'll have a real giggle watching it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then I'd probably, you know, there'd be no reason to go back to it. Whereas with The Reef, I wouldn't go back to it because I don't want to be that scared and tense again. I don't want to go through that again, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting, yeah. I mean, it must have been a really fun film to watch with an audience, I think, 47 Meters Down. I didn't see it at the cinema, but initially, this was produced by Dimension Films and Miramax, right? It's a Weinstein film, and initially, because I think it was actually shot back in 2015, and I think initially it was going to be released on VOD. It was going to go straight to streaming, and then for whatever reason it got sold. Dimension Films sold the rights. I wonder if that's because of everything that happened to the Weinsteins. I'm not entirely sure why, but it then transferred from them to Entertainment Studios, and then Entertainment Studios decided to give it a cinema release because they thought there was potential there, which was clearly the right decision because it did make a lot of money, you know. And I can imagine this movie must have been quite a fun Friday night popcorn movie, you know.
I think you'd have a great time with it. Honestly, I would genuinely recommend it as like get a bunch of mates round. You know, do some shark-themed cooking. Yeah. You'll have a good time.
Absolutely. Well, there you go. Well, Juliet, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. What a fun pair of films to discuss. Final couple of wrap-up questions for you. First of all these kind of nature bites back films, do you have a favourite in this subgenre?
I really love Picnic at Hanging Rock. I think it's a beautiful film. And I think what really I enjoy about Nature Bites Back are these things where we start to kind of almost mix folk horror with nature biting back, and you've got this kind of, is the kind of supernatural stuff there? Is it not there? Lots of kind of brilliant Mary Wild psychoanalysis stuff going on. For me, hands down, Picnic at Hanging Rock. Yeah, you almost can't classify that movie. It's kind of, there's the nature element, there's a folk horror element, there's almost this kind of cosmic horror element to it as well, right? Like you can't quite put it in a box. It's just such a strange, like woozy experience. I love it as well. It's incredible, isn't it, that film? Definitely.
And final question for you, Juliet. What is your favourite horror film?
This is like Sophie's choice when you do this.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if I had to say it in a sort of really classical way, I'd always say Texas Chainsaw Massacre in terms of what horror can do and say and be. But if I think about it in a really personal way, I think it's probably Fire Walk with Me. I think that is my most beautiful horror film. Definitely.
This is why we're friends, Juliet. I mean, like, I couldn't have chosen two better, more perfect movies myself. Yeah.
Great.
Incredible. Well, Juliet, thank you so much for this. Just if people want to come and find you on social media, find more of your work or information about Deviant or anything else you've got going on, where can they find you?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Mike. It was my absolute pleasure. The easiest way to find me is on Instagram, though you will have to search for me because I'm always shadow banned because I'm drawing and painting.
She's always
naughty stuff.
She's always posting smut on her Instagram.
All the time. Oh, God. The thing is, I say that and then people get really disappointed when they actually see what I'm making. But yeah, just stick my name in Instagram, Juliet Sugg. No S on the end. People always want to give me an extra S. And and my website, www.julietsugg.com.
Amazing. Juliet, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mike. Take care.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. And one more time, a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Juliet Sugg. Such a treat to finally get Juliet on the podcast. Hopefully she'll be back again in the future. So let us know what you thought of this week's episode and what you think of these two shark movies, The Reef and 47 Meters Down. Do you think The Reef was as terrifying as I found it? Please do get in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on the socials, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky. We're also on Letterboxd, of course. And if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can join the discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, which you can find on Facebook. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast platforms. And if you get a spare moment, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on whichever podcast app you use, as that always really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week, and next week it's a bit of a change of tone. We've done a few fun, silly animal attack, survival horror, monster movies over the last few weeks and months, but next week we're going dark, and I promise it's just a coincidence that this happens to coincide with Inauguration Week, because next week we're talking about the end of the world. Next week I'm going to be joined by Lee Singer, and we're going to be talking about two apocalyptically good movies, Take Shelter and Melancholia, both from 2011. Whew, it's going to be a cheery week. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.